The moment the doors closed behind him, the world went silent. An uneasy stillness filled the space, a haunting tension as the flight attendant, her uniform crisp and unforgiving, stood blocking his way. The first-class cabin, once filled with warmth and comfort, now felt like a courtroom, cold and unyielding. She glanced at him, her lips tightening into a forced smile, and without a word, she gestured toward the door. "You're not welcome here," her eyes seemed to say. He stood there, stunned. His heart raced, and for a moment, the world blurred around him. Every single person in that cabin, every single soul, looked on with silent indifference. Not one person spoke up. Not one voice rose to challenge her. And that was the moment everything changed. His name was Marcus Reed, a man who had built his life on silence, standing strong in the face of adversity. He had learned early on that words were often wasted, especially in a world where his every action was scrutinized, his every move judged. His hands trembled slightly, but only because of the unspoken weight of a truth too big for the world to bear. He had always been told to hold his head high, to carry the strength of his ancestors, but today, in this moment, he felt like he had nothing to hold on to. And then there was her, Sarah Bennett. She had a smile that could light up a room, but that smile was a mask. Beneath it, he saw the cracks, the coldness in her eyes. She was the embodiment of authority, of power, but she wielded it like a blade. Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she turned to him, her voice dripping with politeness that held no sincerity. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." It was as though the air had shifted. The flight attendants around her glanced nervously, exchanging uneasy looks, as if they were all afraid to speak. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen, something none of them understood. Sarah's cold voice sliced through the tension. "We have a dress code here, sir. You're not meeting our standards. I'm afraid you'll need to go." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but quickly closed it. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in a growing sense of understanding. This wasn't about a dress code. This was about something much bigger, something that cut deeper than fabric and uniforms. He never imagined it would come to this. The helplessness in his chest twisted, but beneath it, something else began to stir, a quiet resolve. His silent strength, the one he had buried for so long, began to wake. He had always feared confrontation, always shied away from conflict. But now, something had changed. And though he couldn't put it into words, he knew this was only the beginning. The passengers around him shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes flickering between Marcus and Sarah. They were like shadows in a room full of sunlight, choosing to remain still, unmoving, as though their own discomfort was enough to absolve them from involvement. Marcus stood there, trying to process what had just been said. The words felt surreal, as though they came from another world. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. He had been here before, felt the cold sting of rejection, the sharp edge of prejudice. It wasn't just about this flight, this moment. It was a lifetime of such moments, small and large, where he had been looked at differently, treated differently, simply because of the color of his skin. But this was different. This was happening in front of everyone, in front of witnesses. And no one was saying a word. No one was standing up. Sarah gave him a look, one that at first glance seemed polite, almost apologetic. But then it hit him like a tidal wave. It wasn't an apology. It was a dismissal, a subtle, calculated effort to show him his place in the world. And it wasn't at the front of the plane. "You need to leave, Mr. Reed. You're disturbing the peace," she said, her voice ice cold. There it was, the trigger, the words that shattered the air. Disturbing the peace. The unspoken accusation that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be seen as a disruption. No matter how much he achieved, no matter how much he earned, or how much respect he commanded in his career, he would always be a disturbance in their eyes. A few passengers, older women sitting in the row across from him, exchanged worried glances, but none of them spoke up. The flight attendants continued their duties, ignoring him completely, as though he were no longer there. He felt small. The sting of humiliation crawled beneath his skin. He had been humiliated before, but never so publicly. He felt his stomach twist with nausea, his pulse racing. Every second felt like an eternity. His heart sank as the silence stretched, suffocating him. Was I wrong to trust them? He had always believed that in a society as modern as this one, the rules would be different. That respect, that basic human decency, would be the default. But here he was, standing in front of these strangers, reduced to nothing more than a body to be removed. And they all watched. All of them. The sound of the plane's engine roared in his ears as Sarah gestured toward the door once again. There was no escape from this moment, no place to hide, no way to pretend that everything was fine. The passengers were starting to whisper now. He could hear bits of conversation around him. Some people were angry, others were indifferent. He heard a woman behind him say, "It's about time someone said something." And in that moment, his breath caught. The truth was being spoken, but not for him. They were talking about him, not to him. They saw his skin, they heard his voice, and they knew nothing about him. Nothing about the years he had spent working to prove himself, to show that he deserved the same respect they all took for granted. The injustice was laid bare. The truth was clear. But he couldn't speak it. Not yet. He wasn't ready. Not here, not now. Marcus took a step back. He wasn't going to let them see how much this hurt. Not yet. Not in front of them. As the days passed after the humiliating flight, Marcus found himself alone in his thoughts more often than not. He avoided the news and the world outside, but the weight of what had happened in that plane still clung to him like a dark cloud. He tried to push it away, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's cold face, the smug confidence in her words. But something inside of him was stirring. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of a thought here and there, the tiniest whisper of a possibility. What if it wasn't the end? What if this was the beginning of something more? He remembered the lessons from his mother, the stories his grandmother used to tell him about the strength of their ancestors. The lessons were buried deep inside him, but now they began to rise up. Things he had once thought were buried under years of disappointment, shame, and fear. He wasn't just a man. He wasn't just a statistic or another black face in a world that refused to see his worth. He was Marcus Reed, and he had more power than anyone realized. More strength, more fight. It was late one evening when he received a message that changed everything. It was from an old friend, a lawyer named Veronica Lawson, who had moved to the city years ago. He hadn't spoken to her in a long time, but they had once been close. She had been one of the few people who understood him in ways that others couldn't. They had worked together on small projects in the past, mostly pro bono work to help those who had been wronged by a system too quick to dismiss them. The message was simple. "Marcus, I heard about what happened on that flight. I can help. But you have to trust me." It was the first lifeline he had received in days. For a moment, he hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to relive that moment, to bring it all back to the surface. But then, something inside him snapped. This was the moment. This was his chance to make sure it wasn't just forgotten, swept under the rug like so many other injustices. He called her. "You've been quiet," Veronica said when she picked up, her voice familiar, soothing. "But you know we can fight this. You don't have to go through it alone." Marcus felt the sting of her words deep in his chest. He had been quiet. For years he had kept his head down, working hard, building his life, thinking that if he did everything right, the world would eventually see him as equal. But all it had taken was one flight, one moment of prejudice, for everything to come crashing down. "I don't know, Veronica," he said, his voice low. "I don't know if I can keep fighting. I'm just so tired." She didn't give him a chance to finish. "You're not tired. You're just worn down. But I know something about you, Marcus. I know you have it in you to stand tall again. Don't let this be the thing that breaks you. Let it be the thing that makes you." Her words cut through the fog that had been surrounding his thoughts. He had forgotten for a moment who he really was. He had forgotten that he wasn't just a victim. He wasn't just a person who had been humiliated in front of strangers. He was more than that. And so, for the first time since the incident, Marcus felt something shift deep inside him. It wasn't an explosion or an outburst. It was a quiet, steady strength, the kind that came from knowing exactly who you were, and knowing that no one, no matter how powerful, could take that away from you. The next day, he went to the place he had sworn he would never return to, the airline's headquarters. He wasn't going to beg for an apology or a chance to prove himself. He was going to demand justice. As he entered the building, he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. The suit he wore felt different now, like armor rather than just a uniform. He wasn't just a passenger now. He wasn't just a man at the mercy of others' whims. He was Marcus Reed, and he was ready to fight. But this time, he wasn't going to fight alone. He was going to bring the fight to them. Marcus arrived at the airline headquarters with a renewed sense of purpose, the kind of clarity that only comes after a long period of doubt. His lawyer, Veronica, had arranged a meeting with the airline's legal team, and now he stood in front of the building, heart pounding in his chest. Inside, the world felt different. The once sterile, intimidating atmosphere had shifted. The soft hum of the air conditioning, the low murmur of people working, everything seemed quieter, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Veronica had already warned him. They'll try to intimidate you. They'll make you feel like you're in the wrong, like you're making a scene. But don't let them get to you. You have the power now. You know the truth. And truth was his weapon. As they walked into the boardroom, Marcus felt the eyes of the airline executives on him, judging, scrutinizing. He had been in rooms like this before. They expected him to cower, to fold under the weight of their cold authority. But today was different. This wasn't just about a flight or a petty dispute. This was about justice. This was about making sure his dignity wasn't stolen in front of everyone. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries, but Marcus could see the tension in the room. The airline executives were nervous, he could tell. They didn't know how to handle this. They had expected him to be quiet, to back down like so many others had before. But Veronica had prepared him for this moment. She had armed him with everything he needed to fight back. The conversation shifted quickly to the incident. The airline's representatives tried to paint a picture of Marcus as an unruly passenger, someone who had caused a scene in first class. The images of Sarah's cold dismissal replayed in Marcus' mind, but he refused to let the anger consume him. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice calm and steady. I was humiliated. I was wrongfully removed from my seat, not because of my behavior, but because of my skin. I was treated as less than, and that is something I will not allow to stand. The room grew silent. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, clearly not expecting him to speak with such certainty. But Marcus wasn't done. He wasn't about to let them twist the narrative. I have evidence, he said, his voice still unwavering. Witnesses, recordings, and the testimony of my lawyer. You might think that your power will make me disappear, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Veronica spoke up then, backing him up with facts, figures, and testimony. It was undeniable. The truth was there, clear and unyielding. The airline executives, once so confident in their control, began to falter. Their power, the very thing they had used to silence people like Marcus for so long, was crumbling before them. For a brief moment, the silence in the room was deafening. It was a pause, a moment where everything hung in the balance. The truth was now undeniable. Marcus wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been wronged, overlooked, and silenced by a system that had forgotten the power of equality. And then, as if the universe had decided it was time for the reckoning, one of the executives, a tall man in a sharp suit, stood up. His face was pale, his hands trembling. We acknowledge the mistake, he said, his voice cracking under the weight of the truth. We will do everything we can to make this right. Marcus felt a strange wave of relief wash over him, but he didn't let it show. He had won, but this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The road to justice was long, and this was just one battle. But it was a victory nonetheless. You're not going to fix this with a simple apology, Marcus replied, his tone resolute. You're going to make real changes. You're going to be held accountable, and you're going to make sure this never happens again." The rest of the meeting was a blur of legal jargon and promises, but the outcome was clear. Marcus had won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been unjustly treated, overlooked, or oppressed. The airline executives had seen the truth, and they knew they couldn't escape it. As Marcus walked out of the building, a sense of power surged through him. He wasn't just a victim. He was a force to be reckoned with. He had stood tall in the face of injustice, and had shown the world that silence was not weakness, but preparation. He had taken the power back. The room was silent. The aftermath of Marcus' confrontation with the airline executives still hung in the air. He had spoken the truth, and now the echoes of those words lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the exchange. Marcus stood by the elevator, his back straight, his eyes focused ahead. Veronica walked up beside him, her eyes soft with pride. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with quiet admiration. But Marcus, ever humble, simply nodded. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who's ever been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed because of who they are. I didn't just speak for myself. I spoke for all of us." Veronica smiled. "You spoke for the truth." As the elevator doors opened, Marcus stepped inside, turning to look at her one last time. He felt a weight lifting off his shoulders, but it wasn't just the weight of the past few hours. It was the weight of years of oppression, years of injustice. It was the weight of every moment he had ever been made to feel small, to feel less than. The doors closed, and the elevator began its descent. Mic drop lines. "I wasn't broken. I was building. You said I was nothing. Now you're asking for forgiveness. They thought silence was weakness. It was just preparation. I wore the truth like armor. You wore it like a costume. Forgiveness isn't for the weak. It's for the strong who refuse to stay silent. You tried to erase me, but I'm still here, and I'm louder than ever. They thought I was invisible, but I was just waiting to be seen. I didn't just win. I changed the game. You thought your power could break me, but it only made me stronger. I wasn't fighting for a seat on the plane. I was fighting for respect." It was a month later, and Marcus found himself back at the same airport. The echoes of the confrontation still resonated in his mind. He had done it. He had exposed the lies. But there was more to it than just that. He had paved the way for others to stand up to. As he walked through the terminal, he couldn't help but remember the look on the stewardess' face as she had tried to dismiss him. That first moment when she looked down at him, her eyes cold, as if she already knew who he was, before he even opened his mouth. But now, as he walked past a few of the same airport employees who had witnessed the altercation, their eyes followed him differently. They no longer looked down. They looked up. Respect, recognition, and a quiet acknowledgement danced in their gazes. One of the flight attendants from that fateful day, Kelly, caught sight of him from the corner of the terminal. She had been one of the silent onlookers, her role in the injustice not immediately clear at the time. She stepped forward, her steps hesitant. She had never spoken to him before, but she felt compelled now. "Marcus," she called softly, her voice low but genuine. Marcus turned toward her, his expression unreadable at first, but there was something softer in his eyes. "Kelly," he said, his voice calm, no longer burdened by anger. I wanted to apologize for not speaking up that day." She looked down, almost ashamed. "I should have said something." Marcus paused for a moment, the memory of the day still fresh, but the sting no longer raw. "You weren't the only one silent," he said quietly. "But silence doesn't have to last forever." Kelly nodded, her eyes misty with regret. "I know, and I won't stay silent anymore." Marcus smiled. "Good, because the truth doesn't need anyone's permission to be heard." As they exchanged a few more words, Marcus felt a small shift within himself. He wasn't just the victim of an injustice anymore. He was the catalyst. He was the change he'd been waiting for. And now, others were starting to see it too. The airport terminal was bustling, yet it felt strangely quiet around Marcus. He stood near the windows, watching the planes take off into the sky. The weight of everything that had transpired had settled into a peaceful stillness within him. He had fought for justice, for respect, and for a voice that had been long silenced. And now, as he stood there, he realized that the fight didn't end with a loud roar or a dramatic clash. It ended with quiet strength. Behind him, he could hear the murmurs of passengers boarding their flights, the familiar sounds of a busy airport. But it no longer felt like noise. It felt like a distant hum, a reminder that life, in all its chaos, could still hold moments of peace. Marcus took a deep breath, and without a word, turned to walk away. He wasn't running from anything. He was simply leaving behind the past and stepping into the future, one where his voice would no longer be silenced. As he walked out into the night, the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if they too were watching, proud of what he had accomplished.